We now come to our time of Bible study. We take a look at the books of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Some of these help us to understand our theme for today, which is celebrating and listening to the voice of God. First of all, we have a reading from the book of Deuteronomy. Many people don't realize that this was the first book of the Bible that was written. It was written around about 700 BC, 725 BC, something like that. And it was a book to remember all the laws and legends and stories that had made the existence of the people of Israel possible. And that's why it's called Deuteronomy, the book of the laws, because it does outline a lot of the laws by which their society was organized. However, it does tell us many other things that are very important as well. And one of the things it talks to us about is what is the voice of God like? It was a society that lived and died basically upon the idea that they could hear the voice of God. And so this book then outlines for us some very good thoughts about what is this voice of God and what is it like. And so we have a reading today in which this is really brought to a clear point. And listen to it now from the 4th chapter of Deuteronomy, verses 10 through 12. Remember, people of Israel, the day that you stood before the Lord your God at Mount Horeb, when he said to me, assemble the people before me to hear my voice, so that they may learn to revere me as long as they live in the land, and that they may likewise teach these things to their children. Remember how you came near and stood at the foot of the mountain while it blazed with fire to the very heavens, with black clouds and deep darkness. And then remember how the Lord spoke to you out of that fire, where you heard the sound of his voice, but you saw no form. There was only the voice. Yeah. What a great passage that is, because it reminds us that the voice of God is something we hear within our head. It's something you hear within your mind. You don't see a form. You don't see a big God standing there saying, blah, 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 blah. No. It's a God that speaks within. You can hear the voice, and you know the voice is the voice of God. And when the believers are assembled, all the believers basically hear the same voice speaking to them. It is the inner voice of God without a body, without anything that could be recognized. It is a spiritual voice. And this was known to the people of Israel in 700 or so BC, in which they were able to understand that they could hear God inside of their own minds and hearts. So that's a good point for us to keep in mind. And the thing also that we want to remember from this passage, by the way, I was almost forgetting to say it, it's something that we as believers should know how to listen to and remember how to listen to, and most importantly, teach the younger generations coming up that they too can hear the voice of God. Very important idea that we who are believers understand you can hear the voice of God, whether you're old or young, and you need to learn how to do that early on in your life. And then, of course, we move on to the New Testament, where we come to a reading from the letter to the Hebrews. We believe this letter was written to the Christians who lived in Rome, most of whom were Jewish converts from the Hebrew faith of the Jewish people. And so the letter was entitled To the Hebrews, and it was written to them. And the problem with living in Rome at that time, it's like living in New York today. It's a big city in those days for that time and place. And there was every kind of belief that you could imagine that was being championed from the street corners. Believe this, believe that, look at this, look at that. They didn't have digital signs back in those days. However, if they did, they would have been flashing that all over the place. So in Rome, it was easy to be misled. It was easy to find false beliefs. It was easy to get into thinking about this or thinking about that or believing in this God or believing in that God. It was a very easy place to be misled. And so the writer of Hebrews sends a letter to those Christians in Rome, reminding them that they need to focus on the one voice that is actually really true. And they need to fix their thoughts upon that. So let me read this to you now as it comes to us from Hebrews chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. Therefore, my holy brothers and sisters, you share together in our heavenly calling. And so I beg you, fix your thoughts on the voice of Jesus, whom we acknowledge as our apostle and high priest. He is the faithful one who was appointed by God, just as Moses was faithful in all of God's house as well. Jesus has been found worthy of a greater honor than Moses, just as the builder of the house has a greater honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything. Moses was faithful as a servant in all of God's house, bearing witness to what would be spoken by God in the future. But Jesus, the Christ, is faithful as the Son over God's house. And we are in His house. And if indeed we hold firmly to our confidence in the hope in which we glory, so as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you should hear the voice of God, do not harden your hearts against it as they did in the time of rebellion. Yeah, what a great message. And the message, of course, from Hebrews is simply this. There's a lot of things you can listen to in this world. There's a lot of voices you can pay attention to. But the believer fixes their mind on the voice of Jesus or God or Christ or the Spirit. You fix your voice on that eternal. You fix your mind on that eternal voice, and you never waver from it. You listen to it, listen to it, listen to it. No matter what other kind of noise there may be in the world, you don't pay attention to that. You fix your mind on the one voice that is the most important voice to you. And when you are able to hear it, the one thing you make sure you do not do is rebel against it or have a hardened heart against it. If you hear the voice of God, pay attention. Very good point there. Then we move on to our gospel reading, and in honor of that, we ask everyone to stand as we read the gospel reading together. It is a long reading, but I will get through it fairly quickly. It's the story of Herod and how John the Baptist got his head cut off. King Herod heard about Jesus, and the name had become well known. Some were saying John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, and that's why he has miraculous powers at work in him. And others said, no, he is Elijah. And still others claimed, no, he's a prophet, like one of the prophets from long ago. But when Herod heard all of this, he said, no, John, the one whose head I cut off, has been raised from the dead. And here's how that happened. Herod himself had given orders to have John arrested, and he had him bound and put in prison. He did this because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, whom he had married. And John had kept saying to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." So Herodias nursed a big grudge against John and wanted to kill him. But she was not able to, because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. And when Herod heard John, he was puzzled, yet he liked to listen to him. And finally, the opportune time came on his birthday. Herod gave a big feast for all the officials and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. And when the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and all the dinner guests. And the king said to the girl, "Ask me for anything you want, and I'll give it to you." And he promised her with an oath, "Whatever you ask, I will give you up to half of my kingdom." Then she went out and said to her mother, "What shall I ask for?" "The head of John the Baptist," she answered. And once the girl hurried into the king with a request, "I want you to give me the head of John the Baptist on a platter right here, right now." The king was greatly distressed, but because of his oaths and his divine guests, he decided not to refuse her. So he immediately sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. And the man went and beheaded John in the prison and brought his head back on a platter. And he presented it to the girl, and she gave it to her mother. On hearing of this, John's disciples came and took his body back and laid it into a tomb. You may be seated. This story from the Gospel of Mark is a story about Herod and the conflict he had about hearing two different voices in his head. He had heard the voice of God speaking through John the Baptist. He liked it. He thought it was interesting. He wanted to pay attention to it, but it confused him some. But he knew that was a real voice, and he heard it. And when John the Baptist was executed, and later Herod began to hear the voice of Jesus, he said to himself, "That's the same voice I used to hear in John the Baptist. It's the same voice we've been hearing from every prophet since the beginning of time." So John the Baptist must have been raised from the dead, and now he lives in Jesus. That was how Herod figured that all out. But what he was figuring out is that there was a voice that he had heard, but he didn't pay much attention to it, or he didn't want to, or he wanted to, but he wasn't sure he could. And that was the voice of God that he heard in John the Baptist. And now he understands that that voice can't be killed. No matter how many heads you chop off, you can't stop that voice. Herod understood that. But the voice he listened to was his own voice. It was a voice of retaliation. It was a voice of pride. It was a voice of vanity. You know, he wanted to do something that would impress his guests. He wanted to do something that showed his power. And he wanted to bring retaliation against John for telling him all the time, "You should not marry your brother's wife." Yeah, he listened to the human voice. So he knew there were two voices, and he paid attention to the human voice. That's what he did. So did Herodias, the woman that he married that was his brother's wife. She listened to that same voice. "I want revenge. I want to kill this guy. I want to get rid of him. He's a horrible person. Got to get rid of him." She listened to that voice. And in all that, John the Baptist ended up getting his head cut off. But the point of our gospel reading today is that there's two voices to listen to. If you listen to the human voice, it always ends in disaster, misery, and difficulty for everyone that there might be. You listen to that voice, you're going to get yourself in trouble one way or another. Even if it's your own voice, you're going to get yourself in trouble one way or another. But those who listen to the voice that never dies, the voice that was in John the Baptist, the voice that was in Jesus, those people find great peace and joy and hope and love and a life that is way beyond this kind of a life that we live here on this earth. And of course, the message that we get from this particular passage is that we must learn how to focus on the voice of God and not the voice of man. And we're going to talk more about that in our message today. So we go back now and we look at our program. And there we find the English and the Spanish together of the key verses that we want you to remember next week as you go through your days. We read them in English and Spanish together. First of all, from Deuteronomy, "You heard the sound of his words, but you saw no form. There was only the voice. Oeste el sonido de sus parábolas, pero viste una forma. Solo Hebrews we have it. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the time of rebellion. See you steadfast, voice to voice, no interest on sus como sucedió in el rebellion. And then from the Gospel, John, whom I beheaded,